Hello, everyone. It's time to bring Justin back again. And today we talk about one really huge forgotten battle or campaign that the Japanese did in 1944 to 1945, the Operation Ichigo. Hello, Justin.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so Operation Ichigo. Ichigo literally just translates as number one. So Operation Number One. If you had any idea how where in the priority scheme this was for the Japanese at the time, they don't really mince words there. So this was actually the largest military operation undertaken by the Imperial Japanese Army in its history. Period. So it involved approximately 500,000 men, roughly 20 divisions. But more important to understand is, other than just the raw numbers, that it involved 80% of the China Expeditionary Army's strength. So 80% of, and the CEA was the army group responsible for all Japanese forces in China. So this was like 80% of everything Japan had in China in this offensive. On the support side of things, there were almost 800 tanks, which is a lot for the Japanese,
Yeah.
including the 3rd Armored Division. Yes, the Japanese did have armored divisions, and they committed one of them here. 1,500 artillery pieces, 15,000 vehicles, 100,000 horses, and about 240 aircraft. Of course, that's a pretty modest number of aircraft. This is, of course, 1944-45. Most of the aircraft had been sucked off into the Pacific, or toward the end of this offensive, were starting to be built up in the home islands. So this was a pretty low priority area they didn't really get any air reinforcements. The operation extended along a 900-mile line from the Yellow River in Hainan Province, which is up there. If you see on the map that we'll have up, that's the Yellow River's just up that northern area with the North China Area Army domain up there. And then it would extend all the way through Hunan Province, which is down there where Cheung Sha is, and then down through to the Indochina border and the province of Guangdong, which is down there where Canton and that area, and then of course down to the French Indochina border. So this was basically an offensive across the whole of central and southern China. And I'm going to actually read a quote from Hans van de Ven about the significance, particularly the post-war political significance of this campaign. So 3 military campaigns in 1944 would have a profound impact on the world order that emerged after 1945. On 6 June, the Allies implemented Operation Overlord, landing 130,000 troops in 3 waves on the Normandy coast. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, by which the Russians inflicted the largest defeat on the German forces of the entire war, destroying the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center. And by August, both operations had succeeded. The drives into Germany from the west and the east that then followed would bring the Nazis to their knees. A Europe divided into a Soviet dominated eastern zone and a democratic west had its origins in these developments. These were Allied successes. The third major campaign of 1944, Japan's Operation Ichigo, marked an overwhelming Allied defeat. Ichigo's forces slashed through the nationalist armies as if they did not exist, clearing them from the provinces of Hainan, Hunan, and Guangxi. By October 1944, Sichuan was the only large Chinese province still in nationalist hands. A Chinese collapse appeared a distinct possibility. Ichigo was as beneficial to the communists as it was disastrous to the nationalists. Having flooded into the areas vacated by both the nationalists and the Japanese, they had grown so strong that they made an attempt at seizing power straight after Japan's surrender. There were, of course, other factors at play in their ultimate victory, but Ichigo set that ball rolling. To that extent, it can be considered as important to the New World Order as Overlord and Bagration. End quote.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's a very significant event. I mean, there's a couple times really where the nationalist armies are destroyed. And the first is very relatively early on in the war, largely around the Shanghai Nanjing area. The bulk of it is destroyed. It's kind of destroyed again, I guess, in 38 in during the push to Wuhan, and then it's destroyed again much more thoroughly in 1944-45 with Operation Ichigo.
So, to speculate a bit here, if this wouldn't have happened, then it could have been possible that the Chinese Civil War would have lasted way longer or that there wouldn't be a communist China nowadays.
Possibly. It's one of those giant
Yeah.
counterfactuals, but this definitely did a number on the nationalists, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later on. So I guess we'll start with inception and planning of Operation Ichigo. Like most people have never heard of this. Like, where the heck did this even come from? So the inception of Ichigo goes all the way back to kind of January 1943. Colonel Sanada Joichiro, head of operations section for the Army General Staff at the time, kind of began a research project into future long-term strategic planning, and he was doing this with I think the Navy General Staff and the Army Ministry, etc. The studies basically concluded that Japan had no prospect of winning the war. Spoiler alert. As part of this, Japan ran the risk of having its maritime links with Southeast Asia cut. Therefore, a direct north-south land route through China would be required. So once this overland route was established, they would be able to continue moving resources of Southeast Asia and China, so rubber, tin, oil, rice, coal, etc., back to Japan. This would enable Japan to rebuild its navy and strengthen the rest of its armed forces for an eventual counterattack in the Pacific in 1946, staged from the Philippines. There was an underlying assumption that the defensive perimeter, like the Marianas in the Pacific, would hold. Of course, this is pretty fanciful long-term strategic planning, but I mean, I guess they had to
Yeah.
lay something out. to,
I
um,
mean, you also assumed that the Soviet Union would do nothing, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
it's a
they
very. This was,
relied heavily on this one.
yeah, it's very, very much wishful thinking. But of course, at this point, as a point in their favor, like, what other kind of thinking are you going to
Yeah,
be doing at this point?
what can you do else? It's like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess we'll just lay down now. So in October 1943, the deteriorating war situation made a so-called overland clearing operation in China even more desirable for the operations section, so that Japan could carry on a land war in China even if they were getting their butts kicked in the Pacific. The growing threat of American air bases located in China was another thorn in the side of the Japanese that the operations section very much wanted to remove. They and the staff of the CEA got all the ammo they would need to win broad support for an overland clearing operation after Japanese Army Air Service efforts to put the US bases out of action failed, and then a American raid that hit Taiwan from Chinese bases did quite a bit of damage and really made quite an impression on Imperial General Headquarters, which then ordered serious operational planning by the CEA in late 1943, and a draft plan was submitted to the CEA, or was submitted by the CEA to the IGHQ in January 1944.
So a bit of a question here. Basically, what were the reasons that this was not earlier done? So the main motivation was to establish a land connection
Mm-hmm.
to ship everything around, and so this was not necessary, not seen as necessary before,
It
or
appears that way, yeah. They'd gotten kind of pulled away by events in the Pacific and all that. They viewed China as a backwater. CEA was basically bogged down, so all the Japanese forces in China and the Chinese puppet troops and all that were bogged down, just trying to hold on to what territory they had. They were holding on to. So implicitly, what this Ichigo plan is, it's an all-out offensive to try and, I mean, we'll get to the objectives in a second, but they're basically giving up any any pretense of kind of holding on to the territory that they are currently sitting in. They just want to surge forward and try to accomplish all the objectives of this operation, and they know the rear area is probably going to just turn into a disaster, which is exactly what happens.
okay.
So yeah, so before this, the CEA is kind of like this backwater. They're just sitting there desperately trying to hold on to what they already have until this wacky scheme to launch a massive offensive is cooked up.
So they were aware that they couldn't really win completely. So because that's kind of interesting that they give up the rear areas. I wouldn't have at first thought about this, but
Yeah,
that's part of it.
it's kind of because one of the objectives. I guess we'll go through the objectives here, so people are kind of clear what they were thinking about. So the fundamental guidelines for Ichigo were endorsed by the emperor in late January 1944. And it restricted the operations objective to the neutralization of U.S. air bases in China, specifically the airfields of 20th Bomber Command at Chengdu in Sichuan province. In reality, though, the aims of Ichigo were much broader. So, as is often the case, Imperial General Headquarters or the people back in Japan would would sign off on something, an operation, but then the people on the ground, in this case, the operations guys within the CEA, they cooked up their own set of objectives that were well beyond what Imperial General Headquarters was thinking. So they wanted to, of course, destroy American B-29 bomber bases in China within range of the Japanese mainland, open an overland route from Busan, Korea to French Indochina, and to crush the nationalist government's main forces along with really any plans for continuing the war. So in other words, this was like an all-in YOLO offensive to try and knock China out of the war. So they were gonna. So instead of like just sitting there trying to hold on to what they had, they were gonna go all in with this offensive to try and knock nationalist China out. Period, and just end formal resistance. And Hans van de Ven, which is kind of he's written the newest history on these events, argues that this last point, the destruction of the nationalist government's main military forces, was the real primary objective of the campaign, because when you actually look at how it unfolds on the ground, anytime there was kind of an option to either destroy more Chinese forces or overrun a US airbase, they always picked the destroy more Chinese forces option. So it's kind of clear that what they were emphasizing. And the great historian of the IJA and the Japanese of this period, Edward Drea, he argues that the overall Japanese hope was that a knockout blow against China would allow them to win some kind of negotiated settlement with the Allies. Of course, that wasn't going to happen, but this was kind of the works back into the Japanese wishful thinking. So I guess we'll get a little bit into the campaign. I'm not going to do a literal blow by blow, or we'd be here all day.
Yeah.
um, we'll have a list of sources in the description that you got. If any of you are curious, you can go and read in detail. So the first phase, from mid-April to late May 1944, the was kind of shortened, named the Kogo Offensive, involved the north-south pincer to clear the southern portion of the Peking-Wuhan Railway and occupy Luoyang. So on the map, you can see, there's a giant salient there. It's very juicy. I mean, I just imagine like even like a German general like looking at that map, how much he'd be salivating just staring at that salient. But the Japanese were thinking the same thing. A very interesting thing to note, actually, this map does a very good job of outlining that, is look at the lines of the Japanese advance. They're exactly along existing rail lines or along the Yangtze River. And it's because that's the way they could really supply anything. People talk about like the deplorable logistics situation in Russia. That looks like, interior China makes European Russia look like northwest Europe in terms of logistical wonderland. Like China, we're talking about like areas where there are literally no roads, like just maybe a couple like wagon tracks, and to the point where when you look at composition, even when heavier artillery is available to one side or the other, they tended to favor very small light artillery pieces simply because you couldn't physically move anything
Yeah.
big around. Yeah, you didn't see a lot of heavy artillery usage in interior China just because they couldn't get it physically to the battle area. Um, anyway, so the second phase, which was kind of from May to December 1944, the so-called Togo Offensive, which was kind of split into different phases. As you can see on the map, there's Togo 1, 2, 3. This consisted of a massive sequenced set of offensives from the 11th Army. On the map, they have translated them as corps, which is not completely accurate. The Japanese didn't have something we call a corps. It went just division, army, and then generally area army. So an army for the Japanese is like a Western corps. So that's why it's been translated like that on the map, I guess. So 11th Army capturing Cheung Sha and Hangyang. I'm going to butcher. I'm trying, but I'm going to butcher some of these pronunciations. 23rd Army seized several American air bases, and they're based out of down there near Hong Kong. 21st Army then moved from northern Indochina to meet these forces. I don't think that's on the map actually, but they get involved as well. They just kind of push up from Indochina. Now, initially, logistics was not a major problem because these operations were conducted within 60 miles of big Japanese Army supply bases. Of course, because, as we mentioned before, the CEA had been largely just kind of a stagnant garrison force for quite a while now. They had built up pretty significant stocks of supplies and major supply bases. However, as the operations moved further away from these established bases, inevitably, major logistical problems began to surface. So supplies were being moved, again, largely by rail or by the Yangtze River. And then once the Americans started to conduct aerial interdiction against several of the Japanese rail lines and boats or barges moving up the river, immediately logistics started to implode. Units were ordered to live off the land, but of course this was insufficient given the impoverished state of the areas they were moving over. China had been in the grips of a famine for quite a few years now, so telling them to live off the land where people are already like eating bark and dying of starvation, not exactly going to supplement the army's supplies very much. But really, Ichigo caught the nationalists wholly unprepared. So after Pearl Harbor, again, the Japanese had wound their operations down in China, and the Chinese were faced with growing shortages of everything. Chiang ordered his warzone commanders, which is kind of like a Chinese army group, to become self-sufficient. And corruption within the KMT's military was rampant by this point in the war. They kind of get this blanket reputation for being just 100% corrupt and inept for the entire period, which isn't actually the case. It's more complicated than that. But definitely by 1944, with the deprivations of war, they were starting to. The regime was starting to just come apart at the seams. Of course, the classic. One of the oldest tricks in the book is to keep units under paper strength and then collect the salaries of fictional soldiers. That comes up dozens and dozens of
So they
times.
over-reported how many men they had,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. That's like one of the most common forms of army corruption. You see it come up over and over and over again. Like, for example, Arvin in the Vietnam War, that they would do that as well. It's just an easy way to fleece money out of the system if you're a corrupt military officer. Tong Bo, the hero of the Battle of Taiyuan, which is one of the few Chinese victories of the war. It happened relatively early on. He was vice commander in chief of the first war zone, which was located in Hainan province, which is the one that was going to be hit first by Kogo. And he stated that his divisions were about 30 to 40% under strength, crippled by poor recruits, desertion, lack of training, discipline, morale, and pretty much everything else. He keep in mind that he was actually referring to what were supposed to be elite nationalist regular army units. He wasn't talking about local militias. So, in other words, it's really important to understand that China had been fighting this high intensity war since 1937. That's 7 years, with the loss of the most industrialized and populous areas of the country taken early in the conflict. The nationalists were not nearly as corrupt or inept early on, though of course, they still had those problems. But it was fundamentally destroyed by this conflict, and by 1944, it was a shell of what it once had been. There were reports, for example, of local Chinese who were sick of nationalist army units living off their land, and also the corruption, the forced conscription into the military, that they were actually starting to attack. There were isolated cases of them attacking their own military units and seizing their weapons. And to make matters worse, from 1942, China was in the grips of a massive famine, as I mentioned earlier. So this is like China is really in the shit at this point.
So basically, the system is breaking down to a certain degree.
Yeah, like it is after 7 years of war, they're barely hanging on, basically.
Yeah, there's basically, I think Mark Harrison has this in his paper about how close the Soviet Union was to an economic collapse. And he basically has this model, I think, that at certain point, at one point, when you realize that the war is lost or something, where everything breaks down, that people then go for their own interests. And it seems like they reach this point here where most people go only for their own interests anymore, and they don't have any allegiance anymore because it's just bare survival as an individual and not a survival more on a scale, on a national order scale.
So this force I've described, the first war zone, is the first one that the Japanese hit like just a sledgehammer in the first phase of Ichigo, and it dissolves in front of the Japanese pretty much. This was a very significant Chinese army group, and it just evaporates. The first phase was completed within about a month, so this northern Kogo operation. And the first war zone did try to fight back, but Cheung was furious with what he viewed as incompetent generalship and a lack of willingness to fight. In fact, when you actually look on the ground, the real cause of the collapse is that the capability of the Nationalist Army units had been completely hollowed out by this point of the conflict. There was no longer this strong core of elite German trained and equipped formations that had given the Japanese such trouble in the early part of the war, or even other regular Nationalist Army units, which would have performed much better in, say, 1940. They were just complete shells of what they had once been. So the operation, of course, initial overwhelming success. It faced a massive number of KMT troops, contrary to older histories and those that come from Chinese Communist Party historians, who claim that Cheung was holding back the bulk of his army against to fight the civil war against the communists. For example, in Hunan province alone, there were 400,000 men deployed in defense of Hunan province. The greatest single battle of the campaign took place for the city of Hongyang, which is down in southern China, just south of Cheung Sha, and it lasted no less than 47 days. So a major US airbase was located nearby, and it was also a major transportation hub. It was a very important city. About 18,000 men held the city with extensive concrete fortifications, which the Japanese would deem, in retrospect, as the strongest they encountered during the entire war. The Japanese eventually had to actually bring in 5 divisions, so just overwhelming strength to crush the outnumbered and exhausted defenders again after about 47 days.
So basically, I've had 5 times the number because 18,000 is more or less
Mm.
a division, depending on the country.
Yeah,
Wow.
Chinese divisions were generally smaller, but yeah, it was a relatively small garrison. Chang had kind of intended it to be maybe China's Stalingrad, but of course it didn't end up that way. I mean, 47 days is a long time to resist, but eventually the Japanese were just determined enough to take it, and it didn't really halt the offensive overall. So it was just kind of just another defeat in a series of defeats. So despite,
I assume it was encircled completely as well.
I think so. Yeah, they pretty much encircled the city. Many of these Chinese cities actually had walls. So when you're talking, it's actually quite interesting when you're reading about these sieges in China. Is that a lot of these literally had like walls around the city. So you're talking, you have descriptions in World War II of them using artillery to breach the walls of the city so that they could storm through the openings or everything like that. And like, if you kind of forget about all the everybody running around with rifles and aircraft attacking,
Yeah,
you'd think it was like a medieval battle. But I thought I'd just note that. So, despite modest Japanese air support, they could get local air superiority in the early parts of the campaign because Chennault's 14th Air Force had been assigned particularly to protect the airfields of 20th Bomber Command and also to support Stilwell in Burma. Um, and throughout this campaign, both negligence and interference on the part of both Stilwell and Chang didn't help the overall situation. Stilwell was being typical, inept Stilwell. Chang was micromanaging. He was withholding reinforcements from certain generals he didn't trust. He was, until it was too late. He was meddling and doing dictator things. In fact, actually, during this campaign, he starts to go like I guess a lot of these dictators do when things start getting desperate. Is he started going? I don't know, like full Stalin in 1940, or the early part of the war, or full Hitler toward the end of the war, where he's taught, there's no more elastic defense or anything like that. Every single position needs to be held to the death. Nobody's withdrawing. Nobody's, etc. He's starting to kind of go that way. So casualties for the overall offensive, it's of course these numbers take with like a giant salt mine. Were estimated Chinese losses are estimated at roughly 750,000. And on the surface, 2 of the 3 major stated objectives of the offensive were accomplished. So the air bases were largely overrun, although not all of them, and a land route was established to connect to Southeast Asia. However, with the fall of Saipan, the Americans had a more effective means with which to bomb the home islands that was going to be immune to Japanese invasion. And then, even though the land route was established, railways and roads had been destroyed by American bombing, and the Japanese were never really able to build up a sufficient network to actually be able to physically haul all of this stuff over land all the way back to Japan. And of course, the big one is China remained in the war. The KMT's military strength and what little prestige it still had left at this point in the war was completely devastated. 1/4 of China's remaining manufacturing base was destroyed, and revenue dropped even sharper because of this loss and the Japanese occupation of major grain-producing areas, aggravating an already desperate financial situation. Chang would write in his diary that 1944 is the worst year for China in its protracted war against Japan. I'm 58 years old this year. Of all the humiliations I have suffered in my life, this is the greatest. So the offensive had been directed almost exclusively against nationalist Chinese positions in central and southern China. In an effort to stem the tide, the KMT was forced to pull even more forces away from their containment to the communists. So the Japanese forces, of course, again, this was an all-in bid to try and knock nationalist China out of the war. The forces were exhausted and overstretched themselves, which allowed the communists to pour into Japanese rear areas that were now devoid of troops. Because again, CEA had been spending all this time desperately trying to hold on to what they had. Now they committed 80% of their entire strength in China to this offensive. Guess what's in the rear areas? Virtually nothing. So the communists exponentially expand their base areas and just start going nuts in the rear areas and really establishing themselves. So, in short, the only real winner to come out of the Ichigo operation were the Chinese communists. And according to a Soviet advisor that was present with Mao at the time, Mao was pleased upon hearing of the various nationalist setbacks. He was very much playing the long game. And we can still see the legacy of his shrewd strategy today because the Chinese Communist Party controls mainland China. They won the Civil War. So you get like, because this is a very charged topic, because you get people that like, of course he loved China so much and he was always about resisting the Japanese, and it's like, well, no, you're going to win it. He had a civil war to fight. He had a country to eventually he wanted to take over and try to impose his political order on the nation, and he didn't like the Japanese, and he was resisting them, but he was also trying to hedge for this longer term struggle, and that's why he won. So it's not really, I'm not condemning Mao for doing this, but it's like it is what it is. Not everybody is this idealized ultra nationalist character that's completely flawless, that kind of a lot of post-war narratives tried to portray.
Yeah, that's usually a problem. It's usually if you win something, you're usually on the gray side and not on the white side. Or
Yeah, and with this with the sourcing and all that, it's such a nightmare, of course, because Imperial Japan ceased to exist and the language is hard. You had a
yeah,
very butthurt, angry nationalist military dictatorship on Taiwan that didn't want to talk for a very, very long time. And then you had a very virulent anti-Western communist regime on the mainland that didn't want to talk. And to this day, a lot of their archives and all that are sealed. So we will never, I shouldn't say we'll never know, but we'll never, we, until their archives are opened, which is probably not going to happen until the Chinese
and
Communist
properly
Party.
translated.
Yeah, and properly translated.
This is also the thing because I mean I don't know how much the language has changed, but Bismarck and I translated a Wehrmacht manual, yeah, and it's like sometimes it's what the fuck are they talking about? And we are native speakers, and I know that I don't know how much Japanese changed, but I know also Chinese is very different for the region. But I think the writing is more or less standardized.
Yeah.
But this just
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
very difficult situation. And since, of course, they're not letting anybody walk into PLA archives and go through all of these, because it's a very sensitive period and they have a very particular narrative they want to put forward. So we're not going to know the full extent of PLA efforts for the foreseeable future. Fortunately, now that Taiwan has kind of democratized, we have a lot more access to nationalist archives than we ever did back in, say, the 80s and 70s and 80s, where they weren't talking to anybody. They were also peddling their own narrative. This is also tied with the Stilwell affair, which I think we'll have to do an extra video on because it's kind of a very complex subject that I'll need to break down a little bit more. Um, but I guess to conclude, I'd like to read a quote about kind of the war overall, China's World War II, by the great historian Rana, who's one of the best historians of the conflict. The ability to reinterpret the story of China's war with Japan enables us to move away from the melodrama. Such a history must restore China to its place as one of the four principal wartime allies, along with the US, Russia, and Britain. China's story is not just the account of the forgotten Allied power, but of the Allied power whose government and way of life was most changed by the experience of war. Even the massive loss of life in Russia that followed the German invasion in June 1941 was less transformative than what happened to China in one fundamental sense. The USSR was pushed to its ultimate test, but it did not break. It fought back and survived. In contrast, the battered, punch drunk state that was nationalist China in 1945 had been fundamentally destroyed by the war with Japan. Western condemnations of the Chinese war effort, and the role of the nationalists in particular, have been based on accusations that the regime was too corrupt and unpopular to engender support. The truth was more complex. The Europe First strategy meant that China was to be maintained in the war at minimum cost, and Chiang was repeatedly forced to deploy his troops in ways that served Allied geostrategic interests but undermined China's own aims. The crippled and unsympathetic nationalist regime that had limped to peace in 1945 was not a product of blind anti-communism, refusal to fight Japan, a bizarre accusation considering the nationalists' role in resisting alone for 4.5 years before Pearl Harbor, or foolish or primitive military thinking. The regime was overwhelmed by external attack, domestic dislocation, and unreliable allies. End quote.
Well, I'm not really sure what to add here. I'm a bit overwhelmed. Well, I'm actually speechless right now, so thank you very much, Justin.
Yeah, no problem.
And thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.